This video is the first of a three-part series, focusing first on why cells divide, the second one is how cells divide, and lastly, what happens when cell division goes wrong. So, why do cells divide? There's three reasons. The first one is reproduction, and reproduction focuses on single-celled organisms primarily. So, a single-celled organism reproduces asexually, which means that one parent's DNA is copied, and once it's got two identical copies, the cell divides in half. Each of the new cells get a full copy of the DNA. There's a limited number of multicelled organisms that can also reproduce this way. They tend to be quite small. In contrast, for us or other larger multicelled organisms, we do not reproduce in this fashion. We produce sexually, meaning that we have two different parent cells. Each one provides half the DNA needed for the new organism, and we're genetically related to, but we're not identical to either parent. So that's reproduction. So cells divide for asexual reproduction. Moving on to the next slide in 3, 2, 1. So we're now focusing on multicelled organisms like us. And the second reason is growth, and we'll spend most of our time on the concept of growth. We start out as a single-celled organism. We get much larger, but we're not a single cell. Our cell's size is limited to its ability to gather nutrients and remove waste. And the bigger the cell, the harder this is. Concentration is a measure of the number of particles of some material in a given volume. So I'm going to use the little strip at the top there. I'm going to use some dots here. And I'm going to say, okay, well, there's one, there's one, there's one. So I'm going to have a whole bunch of dots in this one area. And so that would look like high concentration if to the right I put that. So the left is high concentration and the right is low concentration. So concentration is simply the number of particles in a given volume. So if I draw a box around this, if I make two boxes that are about the same size, the one on the left is much higher concentration than the one on the right. Diffusion is the movement of particles from an area of high concentration to low concentration, and the goal is to spread the particles out so the concentration is pretty much the same everywhere. So if these two were connected to one another, so if I were to put in some kind of pipe here, take those barriers out, now all of a sudden some of these particles here are going to start moving across. And they're just going to keep going across until we have an equal number of particles in the same volumes of space. This is simple motion using kinetic molecular theory. There's no deliberate action. It's just the particles randomly jostling, and eventually, given enough time, they will spread out and have equal concentrations everywhere. Now, the particles, this diffusion process happens either within cells, so that's how particles move within a cell, but it's also how particles tend to move outside of cells getting to their surface. So diffusion isn't a particularly efficient way of moving things, but it requires no energy from a living thing, so it's used an awful lot. Moving on to the next slide in 3, 2, 1. So the last piece of this growth part is water moves by a process called osmosis, meaning that unlike particles moving from high to low concentration, water moves across cell membranes to places where the concentration of dissolved materials is relatively high. So water moves towards other particles. Particles just try and spread out. So water is trying to act differently. It's trying to get to wherever the high concentration is. Now, movement of resources gets slower as a cell gets larger because there's just more distance to travel. So it gets tougher and tougher to move from one end of a cell to the middle. So cell division makes a cell smaller, and because it's smaller, that movement of material becomes more efficient. So that's the piece regarding growth. If the cells are smaller and more efficient, then you're able to, as an organism that is multi-celled, you get larger by having smaller, efficient cells. The last piece is repair. All of us have had situations where we've been hurt, gotten cuts, scrapes, all this kind of stuff, and therefore our body needs repair. Every time you're injured, your body makes new cells to replace those that got damaged or killed. So, our 3 reasons: reproduction, growth, and repair. Thanks for watching.